We are going to start with a statement from the Students for Justice in Palestine at the new school. But before we do that, we're going to just cover a couple of quick teaching guidelines, and then the students are going to speak and they're going to introduce the two of us. Okay, so just so everyone is on the same page about how we're going to conduct the conversation tonight, I want to make sure everyone is clear on the fact that the new school has pledged to support for academic freedom for new school faculty and students in some form. The new school code of conduct applies to students who are in attendance. Islamophobia and anti-Semitism will not be tolerated in this space or at the university as a whole. All mentions of Israel refer to a nation state, not the Jewish people or the Jewish religion. The two should not be conflated. Similarly, all mention of Arab countries refers to a particular nation state, not Muslim people or the religion of Islam. The two should not be conflated. And I take this, we took this guidance from one of our speakers tonight, Siddhartha at Rutgers, who held a teach-in earlier this past week. Anyone engaging in disruptive behavior will be removed from the room in order to allow other attendees to benefit from the educational program. And take the time to listen, be respectful towards the speakers and towards one another. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jana Mohammed from Students for Justice in Palestine to open the event tonight. Thank you.
Here in the West, it is often extremely difficult to conceptualize the many issues around the world that we're shielded from. So those of us living in the imperial core experience immense privilege. American imperialism in non-Western nations across the others, while America maintains its position as a global capitalist power. This is one of many reasons why supporting Palestine, especially at a time like this, is so controversial in the mainstream. Despite this, given the events of the past few weeks, many have been critical of Western media's bias in favor of Israel. We've seen headlines skew reality, weaponize language, and dehumanize Palestinians even further by declaring Israelis as killed while Palestinians as simply dead. We must ask how the weaponization of language brings dignity and respect to their lives while contributing to the dehumanization of Palestinians as they're met with the daily torment of an American-backed genocide at the hands of the Israeli government. It obtrudes an anti-Palestinian, anti-Muslim, and anti-Arab speech in which Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims bear the cost. The moral compass has been and remains broken. As we gather today, Israel continues to, without retribution, rain down bombs in Gaza and surge violence in the occupied West Bank. Israel is no stranger to perpetuating brutality and ethnic cleansing. Israel has shaken hands with right-wing movements and governments in Latin America, deliberately endowing mass murder of indigenous people in Nicaragua and Guatemala and more. Israel prevails the pride in genocide by funding and arming Azerbaijan in support of the country's violent campaign against the Armenians, reminding many of the Armenian genocide by the Ottomans during World War I. We know inside out that all struggles of rights for liberation are interconnected by the common thread of marginalization, woven by our oppressors who have molded the world in order to cater to their own interests. Many have pointed to historic Black American and Palestinian solidarity, or have drawn the connections between indigenous land-back movements in the Americas and the Free Palestine movement, and of course have seen the parallels between Israel's 75-year oppression of Palestinians and the Israeli-supported American wage wars that have devastated and destabilized, and continue to devastate and destabilize the lives of millions across the Middle East. The fight for liberation is a collective one. In the words of the brilliant Angela Davis in her book Freedom is a Constant Struggle, Ferguson, Palestine, and the Foundations of the Movement, whenever you conceptualize social justice struggles, you will always defeat your own purposes if you cannot imagine the people around whom you are struggling as equal partners. We must view Palestinians as our partners, knowing that our tax dollars are being used by the American government to fund genocide in Gaza. We should be exceedingly critical of where America is financially involved around the world and condemn the violence this country perpetuates in Palestine and around the world. This comes back onto us. Silence and neutrality serves as validation in the face of genocide. We cannot sit idly by. We must make every effort in seizing Israeli war crimes and settler colonialism. That's why it's so important that all of you are here at this teaching today to learn, to build community, and to collectively resist. As we are gathered here on campus, I want to bring to your attention the statement released by the Provost's office today, the one titled "Centering Our Humanity." The statement underscores the municipal's dedication to foster an inclusive and secure environment where diverse voices and perspectives can be shared. However, the statement lacks a clear commitment to safeguarding our rights to free speech, nonviolent assembly, and academic freedom without retribution. Across this country and abroad, many who have spoken out for Palestinian liberation have come under attack, losing their jobs, being doxxed, and having their funding threatened. They have been witnessing disturbing policies of censorship and repression at other universities around the city and the world, such as the banning of Palestinian symbols or simply of pro-Palestinian events. New threats of revoking student visas for international students by right-wing politicians have emerged. The Provost's statement fails to guarantee our rights to free expression, assembly, and speech, and does not confirm that names will not be collected, free expression will not be censored, contracts will not be revoked, jobs will not be lost, dissertations not failed. We need to know that we are and will be safe. I'd like to introduce our next speakers and the organizers of this event. Siddhartha Dev, born in northeastern India and a child of a refugee from present-day Bangladesh, Siddhartha Dev teaches creative writing at the New School. His fiction and nonfiction have been long listed for the International Dublin Literary Award, shortlisted for the George Orwell Prize for Political Writing, awarded the PEN Open Prize, and subjected to ongoing lawsuits in India. His latest novel, The Light at the End of the World, has been compared to the writing of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Octavia Butler, Thomas Pynchon, Cormac McCarthy, and Salman Rushdie, and was commended in the Wall Street Journal for its galvanizing anger, its outraged awareness of exploitation and cruelty, and its depiction of the broken world of the present. He is a contributing editor to the New Republic, and his journalism and essays appear regularly in the New York Times, The Guardian, Scent, The Baffler, Endless Front, and Caravan. Our other speaker, Jaskiran Dhillon, is an anti-colonial scholar and organizer who grew up on Treaty 6 Free Territory in Saskatchewan, Canada. Her work spans the fields of settler colonialism, anthropology of the state, environmental justice, anti-racist feminism, colonial violence, political ecology, and youth studies. Her writing has been published in The Guardian, The Nation, Anthropological Theory, Cultural Anthropology, Feminist Formations, Environment and Society, Social Texts, and Decolonization, among other. She is the author of Mobilization and the Politics of Intervention, released in 2017, and co-editor of Standing Rock, Voices from the #NoDAPL movement, released in 2019. The new book notes on becoming a comrade, solidarity, relationality, and future making is forthcoming with Common Notions Press. Jaskiran is an associate professor of global studies and anthropology at the New School and served as the founding president of the New School's AAUP chapter. She is also a cooperative member of Making Rules Bookstore and Social Center in West Philadelphia. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. for those of you that are standing at the back, there are seats in the front. There's 4 seats in the front if you want to come up. There's kind of scattered seats throughout. So please feel free to come and take a seat so you can be more comfortable during the event this evening. So as co-organizers for this teach-in, one of the things that Siddhartha and I are going to do is to help set the stage for the conversation that's about to take place tonight. So on that note, I want to begin by centering land restitution, or land back as it's most commonly known here, territorial defense, and the social movements and resistance of Indigenous peoples worldwide, and to note that we are gathered here in this university on the ancestral homelands of the Lenape people. Their story, the story of the Lenape people and all Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, was and is about land dispossession, colonial violence and displacement, racial narratives, and occupation, just as it is for the Palestinian people. I also want to start by thanking students in Palestine and the New School for their bravery, mobilization, organizing and their strength over the past weeks. They have done incredible work to voice their perspectives, share insight and knowledge, organize and demand recognition of their lived experiences. There are many people who have made tonight possible. Organizing an event of this magnitude on such short notice, I wouldn't advise it, but sometimes that can be done. It's no small task. And Siddhartha and I were grateful to have the help of some of our comrades here in the New School, Sean Jacobs, Abu Barman, Julie Applin, Mindy Suranas, Nav Luna, Gabriel Williams, and a big shout out to Mala Kanuga, and a big shout out to Mala Kanuga and Common Oceans Press for getting behind this event and for providing both the background support to make it possible. I also want to thank the incredible lineup of speakers we have who made the time to join us this evening. We're honored to have all of you with us. So why a teach-in? As deeply concerned scholars, thinkers, and writers, we thought a great deal about the kind of intervention we wanted to make this time when so much is happening. We are all seeing the escalation of violence in Palestine and Israel, grieving the loss of all civilian life, and many, there are hundreds of thousands of people all over the globe, are standing with the Palestinian people and their ongoing struggle for liberation and freedom, and protesting Israeli militarism and colonial occupation that we see reflected in the intensifying onslaught on Gaza. This begs the following questions. What do we do with the access we have to educational institutions like this one? What form does solidarity take and how is it practiced? Part of what it means to practice solidarity, in my view, is to situate the events unfolding within a historical, political, and regional context. And this necessitates the creation of educative spaces where we can come together to learn from one another and have critical dialogues about things. It doesn't mean that we're going to agree on everything all the time, but we do have the right to speak and we have the right to be heard. We have the right to teach and learn about the 100-year war on Palestine. We have a right to share knowledge about the long-standing efforts to isolate, dehumanize, and punish Palestinians for resisting decades of occupation. What UN agencies, Human Rights Watch, and Israeli human rights organizations have called an apartheid regime. And we have the right to demand a ceasefire and work towards permanently ending the colonial conditions of structural violence, war, and siege across all Palestinian geographies, to use our knowledge to compel action, to live praxis that will aid in the liberation and self-determination for the people of Palestine. Being here together, in other words, is a step towards manifesting justice. Given the power of deliberative dialogue, critical thinking, and respectful debate, the right to academic freedom and freedom of expression must be upheld in our universities in this historical moment more than ever. With respect to the New School, we know that as a university, and this is from its official policy, quote, it is committed to academic freedom in all forms and for members of its community. It is equally committed to protecting the right of free speech of all outside individuals authorized to use its facilities or invited to participate in educational activities of the university's academic divisions. A university in any meaningful sense of the term is compromised without unhindered exchange of ideas however unpopular, and without the assurance that both the presentation and confrontation of ideas takes place freely and without coercion, end quote. And students from across the university are quite right to demand that they be saved from retribution. It is a reflection of our times that this must be so clearly stated and reinforced, but it is crucial. Because our right to resist is tied to our ability to share knowledge, to speak words, and engage in action. And this quest for justice and these struggles for freedom are sadly not new. Our ability to mobilize in the present is rooted in the lineages of the historical struggles from which we emerge, the resistance of our ancestors and elders, the people who taught us how to fight. In fact, as Siddhartha and I were thinking about the possibility of organizing this teach-in, it was the voice of my father, the late Sukhdev Singh Dhillon, who grew up under British colonial rule in India and quite literally on the fault lines of partition in 1947, that I heard ringing in my head. Beta, if you don't stand up, who will? You can't expect other people to act and demonstrate a commitment to justice if you don't do this yourself. We know that our personal lines of accountability are always tied to political ones, and thankfully, we never do this work alone. Standing here today, I'm standing also alongside anti-colonial feminists who have been fighting for freedom, justice, and liberation for decades, organizers, writers, and thinkers who have been actively remaking the world around us. I invoke the sentiments of Grace Lee Boggs, who reminds us that revolutions are made out of love for people in place, and you cannot change any society unless you take responsibility for it, unless you see yourself as belonging to it and responsible for changing it. I serve the guidance at Andaye, who teaches us that the angle from which you look determines what you see, and emphasizes the hard work of social change that requires us to think and think again about the world we want, now and in the future. I echo the call for clarity and critique voiced by Angela Davis, who stresses that, I see we're reading the same stuff. Quote, I think it's time for a conversation about what constitutes anti-Semitism, the relationship between anti-Semitism and racism, and the difference between critiques of the state of Israel and its military, critiques of the occupation of Palestine, and anti-Semitism. And I heed the call for expanding our understanding of the Middle East, voiced by Palestinian human rights activist and lawyer Noura Erakat, who says, quote, my insistence on context, which echoes nearly every Palestinian intervention, is to illuminate that there are root causes of this violence. If we contextualize the civilian harm and violation of the rules of engagement, including Israel's manifold violations and its civilian harm, what we should be examining is the underlying framework that characterizes everything that happens. And that framework is the crime of apartheid, end quote. The last piece of the stage I want to set before I turn it over to my colleague Siddhartha has to do with the solidarities that we have built across land and water. As a scholar of colonial violence here on Turtle Island, I know a thing or two about settler colonialism and the way it works to create imaginaries of place and belonging that reinforce and memorialize racialized narratives of civilized and savage, the way it requires a constant enactment of violence, both everyday and acute, to sustain itself, the way it relies on notions of terra nullius and myths of inferiority, the way that educational institutions become implicated in the work of reproducing knowledge systems that erase particular social histories and reify narratives of discovery and superiority. What I mean to say then is that by understanding what is happening in Palestine, one can also come to ask important questions about the history and present day reality of the settler colony we know as the United States of America. This is not about flattening the specificity of each context. Of course, there are nuances and multi-layered discussions that have to be had, but about examining the ways that settler colonialism exists across multiple contexts. But there are things that we can draw from it. We know that settler colonialism is structured in analogous ways based on legal apparatuses, on land theft, dispossession, restricted movement, segregation, national status, gender and sexual violence, resource extraction, and racialized labor exploitation, policing, and incarceration. These are conjoined struggles, in the words of Nadine Neighbor, and the purposeful withholding of water, food, fuel, electricity that we see in Gaza right now is a genocidal project of settler colonialism that is deeply tied to similar struggles against oppression and violent land occupation throughout the world. Perhaps the best way to close out my part in setting the stage then is by sharing the words of Indigenous activist and writer Winona Leduc, who powerfully reminds us when reflecting on the importance of solidarities and seeing the linkages between struggles. Quote, "We can't talk about Israel because we can't talk about Wounded Knee, because we can't talk about Sand Creek or Carlisle boarding schools, because we can't talk about forced sterilization or smallpox blankets, or Kit Carlson and his scorched earth policy in the Southwest, because we have Andrew Jackson on our $20 bill, because we are one huge settlement on stolen land." End quote. And with that, I'll turn it over to Siddhartha.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Jaskiran, for that great opening. Thank you to the Justice in Palestine. The writer Charles Dickens, who wrote very sensitively about childhood, poverty, and debt in England, was also notoriously anti-Semitic in his description of Jewish debt. Similarly, when it came to those he saw as inferior races, deservedly colonized by superior Western people, he had nothing but contempt. In 1857, Indian soldiers of the British East India Company, both Hindu and Muslim, rose up against their officers. It was a violent uprising, the conflict taking the lives of European soldiers and European civilians. The British press went into overdrive, circulating rumored accounts of European women and children killed by Indian soldiers, embellished with lurid and often grotesque details of torture, mutilation, and rape. Dickens wrote that he wished he were commander-in-chief in India, and that if he had this position, I should do my utmost to exterminate the race. Extermination of the race clearly did not happen, although not for want of trying. Over 100,000 Indian soldiers were killed, bodies stuffed into wells, and the civilian population dropped precipitously enough for the colonial overlords to notice a massive labor shortage. Famines would kill tens of millions over the next 90 years of British rule, as Mike Davis, among others, has noted. And by the time they departed, rendering my father a refugee along with a million other people, the life expectancy of the average Indian had dropped to 27. Does any of this matter? Britain itself now has a Prime Minister of Indian descent, which doesn't stop him or other politicians of Indian origin, like Priti Patel, of running an inhumane program of immiseration at home, along with a constant demonization of migrants and asylum seekers, and the usual posturing imperialism abroad. As for India, which is what most of my writing is about, it is ruled by a violent Hindu right government fronted by Narendra Modi, a government that manages simultaneously the task of being an ally of the United States, an ally of Israel, and programmed by a foundational ideology that draws direct inspiration from Italian fascism and Nazi Germany, the Muslims being India's Jews, as it were. I have written extensively in fiction and in journalism on the Modi government's long, bloody program of disenfranchisement of minorities, in particular 200 million Muslims. And I have no qualms in saying that India is, in some parts of the country, nothing less than an apartheid state. Muslims are subject to laws that do not apply to the Hindu majority from whom I am descended. As a Hindu right organizer told me when I was visiting the Ram temple in Ayodhya, built on the site of a 16th century mosque demolished a few decades ago by the Hindu Raj, a piece that I was commissioned to do by the Jewish tablet magazine in New York. Muslims had no place in India as citizens. What can we do? We can't kill them all, he had said to me in a long lament. They should have their voting rights and all state benefits taken away, he believed. They could live and labor in India, but no more. I bring all this up in order to say that I understand at a visceral, personal level the violent repetitions as well as the twisted variations in history, that I know how a nation founded on principles of anti-colonialism, socialism, freedom, and diversity, I am talking about India, founded a year before Israel, how this can morph into a state celebrating new forms of colonialism, exploitation, disenfranchisement, and violence, how a state can go from historical solidarity with Palestine because of its own long, brutal experience of colonialism, a solidarity that does not exclude solidarity with the Jewish experience of centuries of European anti-Semitism and the horrors of the Shoah. But it can go from this to becoming a close ally of Israel. I hope I have complicated matters. That is the complaint some of my family and friends have against me, that I'm always complicating matters. That I can't ever accept the convenient narratives, the official statements, that I am unable to accept that the cause of war is supported by the United States and Britain. It is inevitably a just war. What is not complicated, however, is that we are here in opposition to the logic of imperialist justice, the arc of which always tends towards extermination. I recently reread James Baldwin and is puzzling over the French treatment of the Algerians in Paris, as he attempts to connect that with his own experience as a Black American in a violently racist United States. I was struck by the fact he writes about Camus, that for Camus, European humanism seemed to expire at the European gates, so that Camus, who was so dedicated to liberty in the case of Europeans, could only speak of justice in the case of Algeria. I think we are seeing the same divide being played out in responses in the West with regard to Israel and Palestine, so that Palestine can only be the recipient of Euro-American Israeli justice, never the liberty to which these powers are supposedly so devoted. We are here today in opposition to that, because that is what solidarity means. I mourn the loss of all civilian lives, Israeli and Palestinian, but I do so with the awareness that all civilian lives do not matter equally in the eyes of the imperialist West, that they never have. All humans are equal, apparently, but those described as human animals matter far less than others. We are here in opposition to that, to offer you our thoughts in these broken times, in a broken world, and because we recognize across the very range of our different shifting identities that something terrible is happening and that it must be stopped now. Thank you.
Okay, our first speaker tonight, who I have the honor of introducing, is Sahar Aziz. Sahar Aziz is a professor of law, Middle East legal studies scholar, and Chancellor social justice scholar at Rutgers University Law School. Professor Aziz's scholarship examines the intersection of national security, race, religion, and civil rights with a focus on the adverse impact of national security laws and policies on racial, religious, and ethnic minorities. She is the author of the book, The Racial Muslim, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom, and the founding director of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. Professor Aziz has published over 30 academic articles and book chapters, and her articles have been published in the Harvard National Security Journal, Washington and Lee Law Review, Nebraska Law Review, George Washington International Law Review, I'm not sure where you haven't been published, and State Law Review, and the Texas Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Journal, among others. Professor Aziz's commentaries appeared in the New York Times, CNN, Carnegie Endowment State Journal, Middle East Institute, World Politics Review, Houston Chronicle, Austin Statesman, The Guardian, and Christian Science Monitor. She is a frequent public speaker, and her commentaries appeared on CNN, BBC World, PBS, C-SPAN, MNBC, Fox News, Black Channel News, and Al Jazeera English. Please join me in welcoming Sahar Aziz.
Oh, it's such a invigorating feeling to be here because it's been such a horrific week, and checking the news is just giving me what they call emphatic distress. So first, I just want to say that everything I say is in my private capacity as a professor of law at Rutgers University, and I can explain why I have to make that comment. And the second is, I know all of you are social media users, so please follow the center. The first one is Twitter, the second one is Instagram. So do that as we speak. All right. My job is to give you backdrop, is to try in a very short amount of time to educate you about the context politically, socially, economically, so that we can have the contemporary conversation. And just keep in mind that I'm very limited in time. So let me just make sure how can I see this? Oh, very good. Okay, there we go. Yeah, okay, perfect. Okay, so basic facts and figures. And as the first slide showed, I am intentionally centering the experiences of Palestinians. I'm a lawyer. We're trained to understand that there are different sides of the story. My job today is not to be the judge, to be the impartial arbiter. That's not my job. My job is to provide the perspectives of Palestinians based on the facts given, because it is to counterbalance the 95% of all Western media coverage that provides you with the Israeli perspective. As a result, I'm not concerned that you will not be exposed to the other side. I know you have been, right? Okay, so 2.3 now million Palestinians live in the Gaza Strip. More than half of them are under the age of 18. 70% of them, and few people know this, are actually themselves displaced people. Right? They are not from Gaza before 1948. They were displaced there as a result of what they call the Nakba. The Israelis called their independence war, the Palestinians called their disaster. From 48 to 67, Egypt occupied the Gaza Strip, and from 67 to 2007, Israel occupied it militarily, and then in 2007 it pulled out militarily. However, it has since 67 controlled all the borders except for Rafah, which borders with Egypt. It is currently ruled by Hamas. I'll go into a little bit of detail about that, which was an Islamic charity first established in the 70s that evolved into a militant group. You can call it a militant group, you can call it a terrorist group, you can call it a liberation group. But it originally started as a charity and ultimately took over de facto governance in 2007. Okay, so from 67 to 87, 87 is important because that's when the first Intifada happened. So for those 20 years, Israel militarily occupied the Gaza Strip, leading to the creation of more than 70,000 refugees. In that period, 650 Palestinians were killed by Israel, an average of 32 per year. Israel arrested and deported any Palestinian who resisted its rule, and also frequently and indiscriminately detained masses of protesters. In 1982 to 83, Israel displaced many Palestinians when it began imposing security zone 50 meters wide along the southern border with Egypt. And importantly, during that era, any political expression of Palestine was banned. Artwork made in green, red, black, and white. Palestinian flags were banned. In other words, they would arrest you. I mean, the Israelis would arrest you if you did anything that advocated for Palestinian independence, non-violently. If you had any kind of flag, any kind of visual. And any group of people larger than 10 who assembled for a political purpose were arrested. Israel censored textbooks, magazines, newspapers, and banned more than 1,600 books. Effectively, they were trying to quash even the idea, right, of a Palestinian state. In 1987 is when the Intifada, the first Intifada started. Intifadas, which is called the revolt, don't happen overnight. Right? The Arab Spring didn't happen overnight. You have to understand what led to it. So from 77 to 81, there were 500 what they call disturbances, protests, rallies, rock throwing, but effectively you were starting to see the Palestinians becoming more and more frustrated and more, they had a desire to change their reality. Now the underlying cause, in other words, the trigger, if you think of the Arab Spring, the trigger was the young man in Tunisia that lit himself on fire. So the Palestinian workers in Israel, because that's how many Palestinians made a living, and they reported constant verbal and physical abuse in the workplace, including being cheated out of wages, forced to work under inhumane conditions, exposed to retaliation, following attacks, and feelings of humiliation. So they just built up to the point where then it triggered the Intifada. Just to give you some examples, in 1986 there was a poll given where the following percentage of Palestinians in the occupied territories indicated that they or a member of their immediate family experienced the following. 47% of Palestinians experienced political arrest. 50% of Palestinians had experienced beatings, physical or abuse or threats by the Israeli government. 22% of Palestinians had experienced property or land confiscation. 55% experienced harassment or direct insults by the Israeli military or at Israeli military checkpoints. 34% of Palestinians were banned from travel abroad. Remember, they can't even leave Gaza. 74% of Palestinians experienced curfew. 17% of Palestinians experienced demolition or stealing of homes. 15% experienced deportation or town arrest. 37% of Palestinians experienced fines on military courts. And only 6% of Palestinians reported that none of these things had ever happened to them. This is the reality that they were living under. It's humiliating. It's miserable. So in 1987, an Israeli truck driver struck and killed 4 Palestinians near a checkpoint at the entrance to Gaza, and that started the first Intifada. And it was effectively an uprising that swept across Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and effectively was a series of daily strikes, protests, riots, boycotts of Israeli rule, and of course the children who were throwing stones and shot at in response. So for the first 2 years of the uprising, 175,000 Palestinians passed through Israeli jails. 30,000 Palestinian children needed medical treatment after being beaten by Israeli soldiers. 10,000 Palestinians had broken bones caused by Israeli soldiers. 1/5 of those injured were under the age of 5. 23,000 Palestinians were subject to harsh interrogation, what we call enhanced interrogation, what factually should be described as torture. The Israelis killed about 1,200 Palestinians during the first Intifada, and Palestinians killed about 160 Israelis during the first Intifada. So this was their attempt, after 20 years of no violence, to essentially have a revolt. Now, let me just be very clear. This is really important. When you meet a Muslim, when you meet an Arab, when you're Palestinian, you should assume they do not support Hamas. Unless they do something or say something that shows they do. Okay? Because if you don't assume that they don't support Hamas, you are a racist. To believe that a Muslim or Arab Palestinian is genetically configured, right, to support Hamas is racist. Okay, so let's just get that straight. Now, I don't have a lot of time to talk about Hamas, but I will just tell you some key points that people don't know. In 1973, it was created. That's when it was established. It was established as Islamic charity. It was not political at all. It effectively followed the example of Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which has a very checkered history. But at that time, the Muslim Brotherhood was focusing on social services, medical care, education, clothing, food, water, shelter. It was a social services organization, which of course resulted in it being very popular because these were people that were deprived materially and under occupation. They had youth sports programs, cultural activities, social services, and again, they enrolled thousands of students in schools and kindergarten. So in the 70s and 80s, they became very popular. But they were not political in terms of leading the Intifada or leading or starting the Intifada. That was mainly the other Palestinian, the established strategy of liberation, with the PLO, PFLP, the DFLP, there's a whole class on that. However, in 1987, when the Intifada was triggered, if they were always competing with Palestinian Islamic Jihad and the PLO and other internal groups for who should represent the Palestinians in their desire for liberation. And at that point, if they sat out the Intifada, they were going to become irrelevant. They were going to be seen as sellouts. So this is the transformation. This is when you start to see Hamas become very political and militant. And this is when their charter comes out in 1988, which is what everyone always cites, right? And it says, the goal is to establish an Islamic state throughout Palestine and renounce any part of Palestine means renouncing part of the religion of Islam, and they define the Palestinian struggle as one against Jews. So the charter was clear, right? It was very clear in terms of not accepting the legitimacy of the Israeli state. Also in the 1990s is when Hamas conducted violent, horrific, bloody suicide bombings. Right? So this is when they started to take the lead in the more violent approach to liberation. And however, well, let me restate that, sorry. Before, from 87 until 94, most of what Hamas was doing was what was part of the general Intifada. Right? They hadn't really started the suicide bombings until after 94. What a lot of people don't know in the West, and this is just a descriptive statement, right? There's a difference between descriptive and being persuasive, so I'm just describing something. In 1994, there was a Jewish right-wing extremist, or Zionist right-wing extremist, Baruch Goldstein, who went into a mosque in the West Bank and killed, or in Hebron, and killed 29 worshipers, Muslim worshipers, while they were praying, while they were kneeling. That triggered Hamas and many other Palestinians that triggered their anger. And Hamas then started the suicide bombings. So we can have a debate as to what there were other causes, but this is when you start to see the suicide bombings. Okay, then you have so there's two things happening at the same time in the 90s. Hamas is becoming more violent and taking on the leading role of the physical militant liberation efforts, and the PLO switches. So there used to be the PLO that was that was using violence for liberation in the 70s and the 80s, while Hamas was just doing nonviolent social services. And then the PLO under Arafat then becomes the peacemakers. And you have the utterly failed Oslo agreements. So if you want to critique the Oslo agreements, read every Said's work. But ultimately, In 94, 95, 96, 97, 98, 99, all of this is after Oslo, after the two-state solution, after Arafat and Rabin go to the White House, right, and make peace. 92 days of closures in Gaza. So life is not getting better for them. The economy falls into a deep recession. There are total lockdowns. Unemployment reaches 70%. Closures block patients who require medical treatment. Students are blocked from Gaza to study in the West Bank previously, and families could not celebrate joyous occasions together if they lived in different places. I just want to show you from 91 until 2001. Because everybody was saying two-state solution, two-state solution. The Palestinians tried this. They tried it, and they gave up a lot. But look at how life just kept getting worse. The permit system starts in 91. Sweeping closures in 93. Israel builds a fence around Gaza in 94. The Gaza economy largely suffered from the West Bank in 96. Work permits and permits for family visits become rare in 98. Israeli forces bomb Gaza seaport in 2000. Israeli forces bomb Gaza airport in 2001, right? You could go on and on and on. So what's really important to understand is if you want to at least understand the Palestinian perspective, is ask yourself, what was the result of the Oslo peace deal? And how did Israel behave? And how did the US behave? And how did the Palestinians behave? And what you're going to find is, at least with regard to the party that has the most power in this entire affair, which is the Israeli government, they were not acting in good faith. And that's why when you look at the map now, there's all these, it's just little Bantustans, right? Because the settlements, now there's 1 million settlers since at least 90. Then you have, so as a result, in 2000, you get another intifada. Because you have 10 years of the Palestinians trying to do peace, 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 we're going to try peace, it gets worse, and at some point, Arafat loses control. His people say, no more, we don't trust you, we followed you into this peace route, and he got us nowhere. Things are getting worse for us, the settlements are increasing, Gaza is suffering even more. And in 2000 was when Arafat, remember, and Mubarak go, and Clinton tries to make another deal of the century, seems to be the phrase in American foreign policy, and it fails. And both of them, that's a whole different discussion why it fails, but the point is, another intifada starts. And at this point, it's a much more violent intifada, right? And the Israeli occupation policy of closures, lockdowns, permits, checkpoints shattered the Palestinian economy during the 1990s and led to poverty, mass unemployment, and created a fertile ground for extremism. And I just, you can read some of this stuff in terms of the home demolitions, land confiscations. Again, all of this is relevant because you have to understand how these people are living. The media in this country does not tell you. All the media does is talk about Hamas. The trigger was Ariel Sharon took a provocative visit to Al-Aqsa Mosque, and Palestinians protested in response and started protest riots, and then from there it just escalated. And Israel launched its suppression of the uprising by shooting children in the head on the Temple Mount for about 10 days after the start of the Intifada. 14 children had already been killed. And again, these were rarely reported on in Israeli media, but also Western. Okay, so these are some of the facts to know about the outcome of the Second Intifada. So during the first 3 years, Israel destroyed more than 10% of Gaza's agricultural land and uprooted more than 226,000 trees. The Second Intifada morphed into a nightmare of exploding buses and suicide bombs. Again, it was much more violent. The first one was a lot of rock throwing. And this one was much more violent in terms of the Palestinian response, and the Israeli response was also violent. The response is brutal suppression, extensive bloodshed, sieges, closures, lockdowns, checkpoints, mass arrests, mass home demolitions, and ultimately achieved nothing. 3,000 Palestinians were killed, 1,000 Israelis were killed for those 5 years. There were 138 suicide attacks and 1,038 Israelis killed from 2000 to 2005, according to Israel. And according to B'Tselem, which is a credible Israeli human rights organization, 3,189 Palestinians were killed. 4,100 Palestinian homes were demolished and 6,000 Palestinians were arrested. So you see, right, peace, Violence, peace, violence, and nothing's getting better for the Palestinians. Okay, I'm gonna skip a little bit over Hamas, but let's talk quickly about Gaza. So you know about the open air prison description. No one enters, no one exits without the permission of Israel. As a result, 40% of Gaza's population live in poverty, most of them in extreme poverty. More than 80% of households depend on food aid, and it is very difficult for them. They have no access to safe drinking water, and one of the things that is particularly egregious, what's happening right now, is for 14 days straight, 2.3 million people have been denied water. They have been denied electricity and fuel, which is required to pump the water and desalinate the water in the desert, and also to just operate the hospitals. Gaza just declared, the Gaza Health Ministry just declared the complete collapse of the medical system. So whoever's in those hospitals is dying because there's no power. So even before that, they were already very restricted. All of these are forms of collective punishment. And this is just to show you the unemployment. And all this is before October 7th, 2023. In order for Gazans to work, most of them, because the unemployment rate was so high, 50%, sometimes as high as 70%, they were reliant on Israel to give them work permits for them to be the cheap labor. And that was effectively one of the points of leverage that the Israeli government had, is they actually started to increase them a little bit, and then the war started. Okay. And then finally, this has always been an issue, the electricity crisis. It's prevented restoration of Gaza's only power plant, which collapsed and stopped working about a week ago. It's impeded infrastructure repairs and upgrades. It's forced Gaza authorities to purchase only Israeli fuel. The plant operates at a fraction of its capacity before October 7th because of the inability to import enough fuel and parts owing to the Israeli blockade. They experience blackouts on a regular basis. The electricity crisis worsens the water crisis, and so on and so forth. So again, this is the reality of. This is the reality. I just want one more slide before. This is the reality of Gaza. So just finally, the mental health situation before 2023 is abysmal. The number of children reporting feeling fearful increased from 50% in 2018 to 84% in 2022. Feeling nervous increased to 80%. Feeling sad or depressed increased to 77%. And grieving up to 78%. More than half of Gaza's children have contemplated suicide, and 3 out of 5 of them are self-harming. This is the highest rate in the world. This is before October 7, 2023. Right? So this is the misery that they have been living with. So I have run out of time, but I thank you for persevering. I'm happy to provide more context. But I'll just end by saying something that I think is really important for us. We do not have the privilege of living in a country that cannot influence Israel. We actually have the burden, and it's a weighty burden, of living in the only country that can actually force us these homes. So, to be very blunt, every day that we don't do something, there's blood on our hands. The blood of Palestinian children. Because we can't hide behind that reality. This is a democracy, not a perfect one. And this is a country that we can actually have a chance at doing something. So every single person, go to Jewish Voices for Peace, or US Palestinian, US PCR, US Campaign for Palestinian Rights, pick your group. They have it all set up where you put your name in, they give you the text, the script, they give you the phone number, they give you the email. Every single person in this room, every single day, should email and call at least once a day. At least once a day, at the very least. So we have to do something. Every 15 minutes, a Palestinian child is killed. A child, not a Hamas supporter, a child. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for a great overview. I'm very pleased to be introducing the next speaker, Bruce Robbins. Bruce is my former professor at Columbia and a very close friend. And although we are meeting under terrible circumstances, I'm very pleased that he is here. Bruce Robbins teaches in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University, where he is the Old Dominion Foundation Professor of the Humanities, a title once held by Edward Said, a close friend and colleague of Bruce's. His most recent books are Criticism and Politics, A Polemical Introduction, and The Beneficiary. But he is also a prolific public intellectual who has written on cosmopolitanism and internationalism, and whose essays have appeared in N+1, The Nation, Public Books, the London Review of Books, and the LA Review of Books. Bruce's organized efforts on behalf of the Palestinian cause began in 2002, when he participated with the physicist Alan Sokal on an open letter of American Jews to our government that called for the cutting off of all American aid to Israel if Israel would continue not to recognize the relevant United Nations resolutions. The open letter was published in the New York Times with over 4,000 signatures, translated around the world, and republished in 2006. In 2014, Bruce was co-proposer of Modern Language Association Resolution 2014-1, calling on the U.S. Department of State to contest Israel's denials of entry to the Palestinian West Bank to U.S. academics invited to teach, confer, or do research at Palestinian universities. Bruce is also the director of documentaries, including Some of My Best Friends Are Zionists. Welcome, Bruce.
That was a very special introduction, thank you. I may have been invited today because I can speak as a Jew. And that's totally fine with me. Although these days there are a lot more Jews speaking out against Israel, so I get less credit than I used to. And getting less credit makes me very happy. At least on the discursive level, it actually makes me pretty optimistic. For whatever reason, one reason is Bernie Sanders, another is Jewish Voice for Peace. It's now possible for us to say a lot of things that didn't used to be sayable. Mainstream media coverage of Gaza is still nauseating in its double standards and its callousness toward Palestinian lives, but I think you can see some glimmers of moral common sense in it. So tonight, I am not going to speak as a Jew. It's a little bit devious of me, but as the son of a World War II veteran. My father went into the Army Air Corps with the name Eugene Rabinowitz on his dog tags. Hence, without the best expectation of personal security, should he be shot down. He was a bomber pilot flying B-17s over Germany. At the end of the war, he was squadron commander. One of the courses I teach at Columbia is a course on atrocity. It was because my father was a bomber pilot flying B-17s over Germany that I got to thinking about the subject of atrocity. My father was fighting the Nazis. Fighting the Nazis, you heard this verse from me, was a good thing to do. But his squadron of B-17s bombed cities. If you bomb cities, you kill civilians. A lot of civilians. I thought about this my whole life, but I thought about it more recently with help from a book by the German writer Alexander Kluge, who at the age of 13 happened to be hiding in his basement in the city of Halberstadt when my father's squadron bombed Halberstadt, killing about 2,500 of his neighbors. So thinking about this, I decided not in the technical vocabulary of human rights, but in terms of my own very rough idea of human decency, that even in a just war, killing a lot of civilians has to count as an atrocity. So what does this have to do with what's happening in Gaza now? For the moment, I draw two conclusions. Conclusion number one, the killing of Israeli civilians on October 7th was also an atrocity. Whatever the right words are for an atrocity, condemn, deplore, infernum, they would have to apply here. The second conclusion I draw in the context of October 7th is that the fact that an atrocity was committed by Hamas, and to some extent by civilians who came through the openings in defense that Hamas had made, the fact that atrocities were committed by Palestinians does not make the Palestinian cause any less just. You probably don't need to hear this, okay? I don't know why I need to say it, but I need to say it. It was very simple. It was right to fight the Nazis. It is right to fight the Israelis. Their occupation. You just heard those are all the reasons, okay? So I'm not going to make a list, but you don't need it. So the fact that an atrocity has been committed is a terrible, terrible fact. I don't justify it. Let's say it's unjustifiable. My point is, it doesn't have to be justified in order for the cause of fighting Israel to be justified. Atrocity is terrible, but it's not decisive. What's decisive, Sarah said it, is the context. The context which a lot of people these days are choosing to forget. In the 17th century, when English settler colonialism was driving the majority of the Native American inhabitants out of New England, this is what is known in America as King Philip's War, atrocities were committed on both sides. English women and children were butchered by the Native Americans, as Native American women and children were butchered by the whites. The whites, of course, said exactly the same things about the Native Americans that Zionism and its mainstream champions are saying now about Hamas. That they're barbarians, incomprehensible monsters, exactly the same words. For what it's worth, the same words the US media are saying about the Russians in Ukraine, but not about the Israelis. The fact that atrocities were committed by Native Americans does not mean that the Native American cause was any less just. They were defending their land against intruders, settlers, occupiers. They were defending their right to stay on their land. The same holds for the Palestinians today in Gaza or anywhere. If committing atrocities like the killing of civilians on October 7th is not decisive, decisive in the sense of telling you how to feel or to support, then you will ask, what is decisive? The answer, as Sarah said, is context. Context is, of course, what mainstream discourse has ruled out of bounds every time it makes history start on October 7th. The history, as you just heard, that produced the bloodshed on October 7th didn't start on October 7th. What I'm talking about here with reference to October 7th and the ongoing bombing of Gaza, let alone the threatened ground invasion of Gaza, is the campaign to drive Palestinians out and take over their land. When I taught my course on atrocity, this is kind of advertising for my teaching. One text I assigned was a book called My Promised Land by the Israeli journalist Ari Shavid. The book has a chapter on the atrocities committed in the city of Dhillon in July 1948, in which hundreds of Palestinian civilians were killed. Shavid isn't just an Israeli, he's a Zionist. He ends his chapter on Dhillon by saying, well, it was terrible, but it had to be done. In order to create a state of Israel, of course he doesn't say in order to create Israel as a Jewish state. In order to create a state where my family and I can live, so I won't be one of those bleeding heart liberals who condemn the killers. I shouldn't make a cultural reference because these things never work, I'm too old. It's more or less the same speech that Jack Nicholson makes in the film A Few Good Men. When he confesses at the end, but justifies the fatal beating he has ordered, saying to the prosecutor, "You want me on that wall, you need me on that wall." It's a kind of, I wish I could. Anyway, it's a survivalist version of patriotism, and it hasn't disappeared. Shavit's is a survivalist version of Zionism, and it hasn't disappeared either. The resonance between the two helps explain the sometimes inexplicable support that Israeli violence still gets in the US. But that's not my point. My real point is that what Shavit's chapter shows, on the basis of interviews with the surviving combatants and research into all the relevant papers, is that the atrocity in Lida was not an accident. It was intentional. It was policy. The policy was to drive the Palestinians out and take the city for Israel. Shavit says it. The hundreds who were killed, the rest who were robbed of their valuables, that they dragged themselves down the road into exile, all that was deliberate policy. It was ethnic cleansing. For the literary folks among you, I know you're out there, there's a very beautiful novel in Hebrew about the same kind of ethnic cleansing, not the same city, written by somebody who participated in ethnic cleansing. It's called Kirbet Kiza. It's by S. Yisar, and it is taught, or perhaps only used to be taught, in some Israeli high schools. So, what's the historical context that helps you figure out how to feel about Gaza? Ethnic cleansing. As Sahar told you, more than half of the residents of Gaza who are currently being bombed indiscriminately, as the Israelis have committed themselves to say openly that their goal is not to destroy Hamas, but to do as much damage as possible, meaning killing hundreds of children a day. More than half of the residents of Gaza are families of refugees driven out of their homes by the ethnic cleansing of 1948. When I see teary-eyed interviews with Israeli survivors on CNN, I think of an extraordinary bit of video footage of an old man, a soldier in 1948, saying that his company used to lie in wait at the Gaza border on the Israeli side and shoot the farmers who tried to sneak back across the border to water their fields. Because you see, the farmers loved their fields and couldn't believe, he says, that they would never be allowed back to tend those fields. So the fields needed to be watered. The old man cries as he remembers what he and his fellow soldiers did to them. This is footage they don't show on CNN. I don't condone violence against civilians. But that doesn't make the terrible violence committed by Hamas incomprehensible. It is comprehensible. It's what happens when you keep people in an open-air prison for 75 years. I'm not going to go on and on and on about things that you know and have heard. So just a few final words on violence and then I'll stop. If you're going to use the word terrorism about Hamas, and I do understand the impulse to do so, if you're going to call Hamas a terrorist organization, as the US does, then you would have to also say that Israel is a terrorist organization. And you have to do with Israel what you do with terrorist organizations. For starters, cut off all aid to it. Otherwise, you're flaunting your double standard, your moral inconsistency, and no one should take seriously the syllable you say. If you're going to use the word pogrom, a term that has a terrible resonance for Jews, you're going to have to describe the pogroms that the fundamentalist settlers on the West Bank have been doing to Palestinian inhabitants of the West Bank every goddamn day. In 2018 and 2019, activists in Gaza tried to bring their situation before the eyes of the world by means of what they called a Great March of Return. It was a non-violent demonstration at the border that Israelis have established. You heard about it. The result was the shooting by the Israelis of something like 200 people. That is 200 people killed. I don't know how many wounded. Of those, 29 seem to have been Hamas militants, so roughly, let's say 85% was what you might call innocent bystanders. That's the Israeli response to non-violence. And you wonder where the responsibility lies for the violence of October 7th. Not at all in one place. I imagine most of you remember, some of you anyway, the fury that was unleashed over the past 10 or 15 years against BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. The Zionists went crazy over BDS, and they brought their mighty propaganda machine to bear on political leaders at every level, as well as university presidents and other highly principled representatives of free thought. BDS was vehemently denounced, although it was, as we now have good reason to remember, an attempt to make a case for justice for Palestinians in a totally non-violent way. It was an initiative of Palestinian civil society, and it was a non-violent initiative. Where does the responsibility for the violence lie? Every time BDS was denounced, the people denouncing it were pushing the Palestinian people toward desperation and pushing them toward violence. Any American who blames the violence on Hamas, or even just on Hamas and Israel, is not looking in the mirror. What's happening is not a war. You know, I'm just going to stop.
Just one sec, guys. Let me switch out the slides.
Okay, so our next speaker tonight is Dhillon. I hope I pronounced your last name right, and if not, please forgive me. Who's an anthropologist and former engineer whose research is focused primarily on Gaza and the surrounding region. She is currently a postdoctoral scholar at Columbia University's Center for Science and Society and lecturer in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences, where she teaches about the ongoing colonial legacies in the earth and climate sciences and the need for centering other forms of knowledge. She's published contributions in Open Gaza, Architecture of Hope, where she's written about the problematic framings of the Gaza Strip, in Gaza on Screen, where she has co-written a chapter analyzing videos of Palestinian resistance, and in the London Review of Books, where she wrote about a secret Israeli ethnic cleansing scheme that resulted in her great uncle's expulsion to Paraguay. Her current book manuscript, tentatively titled Prophecies of Palestine, Geology and Intimate Knowledge of the Subterranean, examines the colonial encounters of Gaza's tunnel diggers with Israeli military geologists within the broader context of the history of Palestine and the history of geology as an extractive and colonial discipline. She has also made 2 short films, which I'm going to have her pronounce so I don't mess up the pronunciation, which despite their age continue to be relevant. Please join me in welcoming Dhillon.
Hello everyone, and can you hear me? Yes. Thanks for having me. It's nice to be back at the new school. I did my master's here many years ago. I don't really enjoy speaking in public, to be honest. It's quite stressful for me, especially these days as It's been very discombobulating, keeping up with family in Gaza and being here, it's like being divided in two dimensions. So forgive me for reading this talk. I wish I could be more eloquent or more entertaining somehow to compete with the short attention spans of the American public, of which I am one. I remember very distinctly how the war in Iraq played out on American TV screens. The war on terror was aesthetically like Monday Night Football. War is entertainment here. It is so deeply baked into the culture and into so many aspects of our lives in ways that many do not notice, or at least do not know the extent of it. Much scientific knowledge is produced through war and militarism. Our infrastructure is the business of military, Army Corps of Engineers, responsible for the levees that broke during Katrina, and so much more, because it is foundational to here. Settler colonialism, which we heard about as the framing for what's going on now, is war. The United States of America was founded on war, genocide, and enslavement, which is also war. The United States tells its history through wars. My working class Louisiana public high school history teacher was a war veteran. And we were hearing war stories from him the whole time. This country cannibalizes its own for war. My high school, and most high schools with large populations of color and of working classes, are crawling with recruiters. I remember a little village, a neighborhood in Chicago, the whole second floor of the high school was Army recruitment. This country's leaders takes our tax dollars and turns it into profits for them, and it does so by being what my cousins call Shahid Dam, these drinkers of blood. He was referring to the West in general. In Gaza alone, since October 7th, the numbers of the massacre may soon reach 10,000 people. And this graphic here just gives a snippet of the years and years of this happening. Of course, the earliest massacres of Palestinians were in 1948. This goes from 2008 to 2020. Those numbers are abstract numbers for many people. Just like the dead in Afghanistan, in Iraq, Cambodia, Vietnam, the list goes on, to Google the number of countries the US has bombed since World War II. But this is my family, filmed in Gaza in 2013. Besides them, the people that you'll see pictured here, the dead on my mother's side of the family, extended family, has come to over 60. Another 30 today were killed from a Lahud family in Shafat camp. This thirst for blood shows no signs of relenting, not from Israel, nor from the United States, who till now is still refusing a call for a ceasefire and continues to fill Israel's coffers with more and more weapons. Palestinians have long been aware of this. I remember my uncle, this one right here, with the white beard, they're sweethearts, you know, they're very caring people. I remember my uncle in 2014 calling me and asking, why is Obama sending more bombs for them to bomb us? These past 2 weeks, I and many others have been trying to check in daily with loved ones there, and we all know it's just a matter of time, or luck, before a US-made bomb sheds their bloods. So please continue doing all you can to push for a ceasefire now. Guided by my uncle's questions, I want to speak more to the US role in what has been happening in Palestine, which has been monetarily, ideologically, and legally supporting it. After monetarily, I think most people know by now that the US has been giving $3.8 billion annually. Of course, Biden is asking for more now. From the Wall Street Journal, this quote, Israel is the largest cumulative recipient of overall US aid since World War II, including billions for missile defense and purchases of US military equipment. The cumulative amount given is estimated to be $318 billion, adjusted for inflation. All this US government funding for war and militarism also translates into the private sector, corporations and investors as war profiteers. Weapons manufacturers are profiting enormously now, as they do in every war. Most notoriously perhaps Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, and General Dynamics Corporation. General Dynamics, for example, manufactures the Mark 80 series bombs. Earlier versions of this bomb were tested on VA base in Puerto Rico. Over there, they were testing what's called the Mark 82 bomb, which was a 500-pound bomb. This ended in '99 after many protests and accidental careless killing of Puerto Ricans, but the island and its people are still reeling from the toxicity left behind. The U.S. military is still testing its weapons elsewhere, Guam, Hawaii, and of course, Gaza, through Israel, which many have described as a laboratory for U.S. and Israeli weapons. Now in Gaza, they're dropping Mark 84 bombs, 2,000-pound bombs. As for Lockheed Martin's weapons, Israel was the first foreign country to fly its advanced F-35 fighter, and now the United States has sent at least 2 massive warships, including one that is the largest ever constructed warship in history. And its first mission is to go to Israel. In other words, Israel continues to be a testing ground not only for Israeli weapons, but American ones too, which then go to export war around the world, with India being Israel's biggest customer. Shares of General Dynamics and all these U.S. manufacturers spiked with the start of this current onslaught. You can just look on the stock market and see the 1 month view, and you'll see a big jump, as always happens. And it seems our own Congress members are cashing in and buying these stocks. This is a quote from an investment advice website, an investment advisor. I'm not an investment person, but what he says on his advice, the market is a reflection of geopolitical events, and those with the rare foresight can harness its potential. As they say, it's about buying the rumor and selling the news. Congressional moves, while subject to scrutiny, can often offer a finger on the pulse of where the smart money might be heading. These are our Congress representatives. But now let us talk about the legal framework, the way that the U.S. is supporting Israel in terms of legalities that enables all of this delegitimization of Palestinian resistance. The U.S. State Department list of foreign terrorist organizations, and you should know about this, you should open it and read it. You can just Google State Department or state.gov foreign terrorist organizations. One thing that's important to understand is that every single Palestinian political organization is on this list, with the exception of the non-military wing of Fatah, which is a party of the Palestinian Authority, which has no legitimacy with the Palestinians and is basically functioning as an arm of the Israeli military in the West Bank. But the armed wing of Fatah is on the list, which is called the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades. It's important for us to know these details, not to let them reduce things to a caricature of Hamas, okay? The armed wing of Fatah, Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades is on the terrorist list. Hamas, of course, is on the terrorist list. Islamic Jihad and PFLP, the last 3 since 1997. We can get into what gives the U.S. the right to call anyone a terrorist, given its own behavior both domestically and abroad from its inception until now. And we can get into who else has been deemed terrorists, from Mandela to environmental justice activists locally. In my view, we need to abolish not only this terrorist list, but the use of the word terrorism entirely. Let me just read to you what it means legally. Okay, so if you open this list, this website at the bottom will have some verbiage. It is unlawful for a person in the United States to knowingly provide material support or resources to a designated FTO, foreign terrorist organization. Material support is defined as any property, tangible or intangible, or service, including currency or monetary instruments or financial securities, financial services, lodging, training, expert advice or assistance, safe houses, false documentation, identification, communications equipment. The list is very long and very broad. And Palestinian Americans have been criminalized and even imprisoned under this rather vague and broad legal rubric, most famously the Holy Land 5. This criminalization of Palestinian resistance and rendering them as terrorists legally has led to a total misunderstanding and non-engagement with them and a complete lack of any nuanced understanding. Instead, Palestinian resistance in all its manifestations and its diversity of forms has been reduced to terrorism and Hamas in Western discourse. And of course, Hamas is a part of Palestinian society. We have to recognize that fact. Okay, I don't necessarily agree with this attempt to make a hard separation between Hamas and Palestinians. Not everyone is a Hamas supporter or a member, this is absolutely true, but many are supporters. Many are employed by Hamas, and it is the local government that oversees all aspects of society the way any government would in the Gaza Strip. Ministries of culture, police, etc. These are all entities that are run by the local government, which happens to be the Hamas government now. However, before it became a cause, as I say, we heard a little bit of the history from Siddhartha, but its beginnings emerged as a social organization, and later it came into the political arena and was elected by popular election. This is important to remember, that the Palestinian people were sick and tired of the corruption of the Palestinian Authority, and in 2006 came out in bigger voter turnout than any voter turnout in the United States has ever seen. So they were just wanting to get rid of their corrupt rulers. Of course, and I think Jimmy Carter was there, and George Clooney was there. These people are going to teach Palestinians how to vote, you know. And you should read. They gave great reviews of the election. But of course, the West did not accept this. They were not allowed to come into power in the West Bank, and they took power by forcing the Gaza. Since then, it's divided itself into a political wing and the military wing, known as the Qassam Brigades. And I'm saying all this because I think it's important for us to break this barrier and understand on a nuanced level what is Hamas. You can look up a book by Khalid Farouk, H-R-O-U-D. Sarah Roy has written about them. The most recent one is Sandeep Sen. So let's expand outside of this caricature. Okay. It's also important to understand that the current resistance active on the ground is not just Hamas. And while they may be taking a lead role, the resistance actually comprises of many different groups coordinating together, at least since 2021, during the Unity Intifada in what became known as the Joint Operations Group. This includes the armed wing of Fatah, which is called the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, the armed wing of Hamas, which is called the Qassam Brigades, the armed wing of Islamic Jihad is all an armed wing, I think mostly, of Blitz Brigades, and even PFLP, which many scholars have written about, kind of romanticized in terms of the resistance from the 60s and 70s. The leftist group is actually still active, and their armed wing is called Al-Hadi Muslim Brigades. Even outside of this, there are several smaller new groups emerging, such as the Lions Den in Nablus in the West Bank, which, as far as I know, has no explicit affiliation with any of the groups I just listed. Again, they deserve to be studied, they deserve to be understood, not to be flattened into a caricature. And we heard, of course, from Professor Robbins about all the attempts at nonviolent resistance that were met with violence, right? And even those were branded as terrorists and Hamas supporters. Oh, I'm almost done. This kind of nuanced understanding of different aspects of Palestinian society resistance to their colonization and ethnic cleansing by Israel is entirely eclipsed, especially in Western mainstream media, by the United States language and legal definitions of Hamas as terrorists, and its definitions extended to all Palestinians by the fact that all of Gaza's population is deemed a legitimate target openly by Israel's leaders, with the United States cheering them on. But again, you can make the effort to understand this at a deeper level. So my question now to the audience, again, thinking back to my uncle's question from 2014, for all of us Americans, or people living in America, the United States, myself included, is why is there no anti-war movement here? Not just for Palestine. Of course, now we still need to keep pushing hard for the immediate ceasefire. This is a priority now. But beyond this, before this, why is there no anti-war movement? Last year alone, the United States spent $756 billion on military. This year, $773, the highest ever. Why are the American people standing for this, especially given our economic conditions here? If we are only to care about ourselves, forget the millions killed around the world by the U.S. military machine and those killed domestically by increasingly militarized police. The U.S. military is also the largest source of carbon emissions in the world, the largest consumer of fossil fuels in the world. So not just for Palestine, but for all of us, where is our anti-war movement? This is a moment to build it, starting with this movement for immediate ceasefire, but not ending there. I have been thinking a lot about how these moments, genocide times, we can call it, when the ethnic cleansing is faster, somehow Despite that, our relations have become stronger. Family ties are rekindled, communities like this gather, people get back in touch. The rhizomatic networks of kin and solidarity and love come alive. I've spoken with people I haven't spoken to in years these past few weeks. I've learned more about my family, which I've been more restricted from seeing, very rare that I'm able to get into Gaza. I'm sure many of you are experiencing the same of these rekindling of relations, like this moment here. Let us use this moment, put an end to our lives as war. Keep pushing to stop the ceasefire, take this momentum in these newfound relations and solidarities to truly change our world and end U.S. militarism and its war on the world in all its forms, once for all, and let Palestine be accomplished. Thank you.
People at the back, there are seats available in the front, so feel free to come forward, make yourselves comfortable, sit down. It is a, long session, so you might want to, grab the seats. They're empty actually, especially on the left side. Thank you so much, Dave. Thank you. Our next speaker is Tony Karen, and Tony is the editorial lead at AJ Plus, Al Jazeera digital social media publisher. Before his 10 years with Al Jazeera, he spent 15 years at Time magazine, where he was a senior editor. I believe Tony is going to talk about that time. A native of South Africa, he was an activist in the anti-apartheid liberation movement throughout the 1980s. A resident of Brooklyn, New York, he has been an adjunct professor in the graduate program in international affairs at the New School since 2010. Welcome, Tony.
Okay, I think there's a lot to talk about, and we don't have very much time to rush through. First, on a personal note, because the two things I've been asked to talk about, one was what's the situation, how to read the situation on the ground right now. It's very complicated, that can also be very cold. And so, just a little note on where I'm coming from. Firstly, I'm not here representing Jazeera, but I am here as somebody incredibly proud to work for an organization who puts its journalists on the ground and they're willing to put their lives on the line to tell a story. A story that most Western media are ignoring and are distorting. So, we're going to have more Sharina about this, because we know that. And the journalists on the ground in Gaza, sorry for being emotional, but they know that, and they're there. I'm also speaking as a retired revolutionary from South Africa, a Jewish revolutionary who spent a decade in the African National Congress, liberation. Something I heard that was also listed as an FDR in 2008. Condoleezza Rice took Nelson Mandela off the terrorist watch, just saying. Also, someone who's, somebody who has many friends and comrades in Palestinian activist spaces who are mourning loved ones killed in Gaza, who are incredibly anxious about the survival of the remainder of their family. And also with many friends and comrades in Israel who are engaged and have been in the struggle against settler colonialism from inside Israel, from inside the community that claims to be represented by that, who are, obviously facing a very different set of challenges, but are traumatized by what's happening because of what it does to the Liberation Project, or what it potentially does, or what the state that claims to act on their behalf is about to do. So in all of that, I always remember the spirit of our movement, that at the end of the day, as Amy Cesar put it, everyone is welcome at the banquet of victory. That the struggle against settler colonialism for me in Palestine is one where everyone who was born in Palestine has a right to be there, but not a right to settler colonial domination, not a right to impose apartheid, not a right to claim power and privilege over others. That's what I hope to see, and The question of how that turns out will be a matter of struggle. So, okay, the colder part. What's happening right now? I'll skip the horror because we're all seeing the horror. We're all frustrated about rage tweeting day and night, tears of rage, hours and hours on end. Unfortunately, we can't liberate Palestine with our thumbs, if only. But what you do with your thumbs is very, very, very important, because the media narrative right now that the Israelis and the American government is trying to enforce and impose is one in which essentially we're not paying attention to the suffering of Gaza. We're not paying attention to Palestinian children being pulled from the rubble every day. Social media makes that impossible. They cannot control the narrative, even though they can try and control the very platforms on which we actually communicate. They're being overwhelmed, and that's important. You can overwhelm them with volume. All of the assumptions of many of the players in the region have been shattered in the last couple of weeks. Question that some are asking is, why hasn't Israel launched its ground invasion? It's wanted to promised ground invasion until now. And I think you can see three elements to this. You can see there's hostage pressure. Western governments are saying, hang on, we need to negotiate this. The Israelis are not negotiating, but they're relying on the US, on the Qataris and the Egyptians to negotiate for them. But there's a sense of Israel doesn't like to, obviously nobody likes to lose hostages. Israel has, remember when they swapped Gilad Shalit in 2006 for 1,000 prisoners, so they have that exaggerated sense. So there's a pressure on them to hold back. Obviously, they have a tactical disadvantage. October 7th showed that they actually have very, very poor understanding of what's going on the ground in Gaza. And they lost 62 soldiers in the 51-day war in 2014. They expect high casualty levels if they go into Gaza. And they would be going in fairly blind. But I think, maybe the biggest question is that they don't have a strategy. They talk about destroying Hamas. Hamas, who they've relied on to govern Gaza for the last 20 years. Hamas is for them, the vehicle has been the vehicle of stability in Gaza. And they have this incredibly cynical idea that they call mowing the lawn. As in, basically, for them, the modus vivendi with Gaza and with Hamas is that every 3 or 4 years, they will indulge in mass carnage in the hope of decapitating another layer of Hamas leadership and restore a violent equilibrium for another few years. Basically, Moshe Dayan in 1956 told the Israelis exactly what they face in Gaza and why they will basically always be in a situation of making war on Gaza. There's at the funeral of a kibbutznik called Roy Rottenberg, who was killed by Fedayeen from Gaza at the border. And Dayan at the funeral said, you're all looking at Gazans and being outraged and how did this happen and so on. He's like, of course this is going to happen because for the last 8 years, it's 1956, they have been sitting in refugee camps just over there. They've been watching us turn the land that was theirs and their fathers into ours. Chalas, to use an argument expression. That's why this is happening. That's why this is going to happen. He makes it absolutely clear. And of course, he's a Zionist. He's not going to question, the premise. But there's no political solution. The Israelis have no solution for. Firstly, whether they can. It's a bit of a myth that they can destroy Hamas. Even militarily, perhaps. But Hamas survives politically. In one form or another. And whether it's called Hamas or whether it's called something else, they're not going to solve the political problem that colonization, apartheid, siege produces resistance. It will, it's obvious. So I think the Americans, this is what you're seeing right now. It's really shockingly, inept is even the wrong word. Like mediocre is even the wrong word. But you have an American leadership that is so engaged in domestic politics and in illusions. You listen to Biden and it's like, it makes absolutely no sense what he's saying. Hamas isn't, most Palestinians are not Hamas, but we support mass bombing Gaza. Well, it's like, how do you square that one? But also, you would think there was an era, maybe it was Bush's father, where the idea would be, look, Israel has a political problem. Israel needs to solve a political problem. They might not have favored a very healthy solution, but they still had the sense of, here's a problem, it's a security risk for everybody, we've got to help the Israelis and manage them. And now you have the leadership that can see the Israelis are stung by a psychosis of revenge. And it's like, if you really wanted to help them, you might be actually thinking what you need to do is restrain them from essentially setting the whole region on fire. And then there's this idea, Israel has the right to defend itself. What does that even mean? It's like, to defend what? What is Israel? What are we talking about when we talk about Israel? That's never obviously part of the conversation. So I think given that the restraint on Israeli escalation now is the shifting media conversation, and the shifting conversation in Western publics in particular, it underscores the importance of what you're all doing and what you're all speaking to. We've seen at AJ Plus, for example, the videos we do on solidarity actions around the world, and there are so many solidarity actions around the world, have an incredibly powerful effect, not only on Palestinians signaling that they're not alone, and that's really important for what people are going through right now, the sense that the world is with you, but also it cultivates its own, echo chamber is the wrong word, it cultivates a dynamic of rebellion, of the sense of there's an unjust global order in which all of this is permissible and possible, and Palestine becomes the center of resistance to that unjust international global order. So, yeah, keep giving us the images so that we can keep broadcasting. One other thing I noted. Okay, 5 minutes. Okay. Very important thing to keep an eye on, which we were doing before October 7th. Like, what was the Israeli government's strategic priority before October 7th? It was what we call Nakba 2.0. It was basically settler pogroms in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem designed to shift demographics in favor of pursuing a Jewish Israeli majority from the river to the sea, minus Gaza, really, because they had assumed that they could simply, the status quo with Hamas running Gaza and what they call mowing the lawn, it was stable and permanent, and they could eventually take the 2 million Palestinians of Gaza out of the equation. So that strategy is being escalated and accelerated right now. That whenever the world is talking about Gaza, the world is talking about, for good reason, obviously. But what the Israelis are doing is escalating. I think there's been more than 100 Palestinians killed in West Bank villages in the last week. And, the Israeli military had redeployed away from Gaza to protect these pogromists. And so watch for that happening, and watch for Western governments actually seeing that as, well, this is retaliation, in the way that they give Israel the right to defend itself, blah, blah, blah. You blow up a mosque in a West Bank, well, that was a Hamas cell, right? So, I think that is an important element of what's going to happen. The ceasefire pressure is obviously the key. I think a lot of people, even people on the left, were quite rattled by what happened on October 7th, and that's fine. I mean, it was pretty shocking. Violence against civilians is shocking, even though we understand the context, and yes, I mean, I don't think any of us can be comfortable with that. But I think what's happened since has kind of settled everybody on whatever you think, whatever your perspective on what happened exactly on that day. Demanding a ceasefire now is absolutely uncontrovertibly a point of consensus over a very wide range of people. I was going to talk about what prevailed on okay, we'll leave on 2 minutes, okay. So 2 things about the media. I could go on spend a lot of time about the media, because you know what's wrong with the media. You see it. It strips the context, strips history, everything just happened out of the blue. Everything was normal. What is it? No, it was a normal country, and then this thing just came out of the blue. Hamas is ISIS, etc., etc. There's a habit of assuming the truth of what the Israelis are telling you, which is pretty bizarre, because if you look, There's a great piece on Time. Orly Halper, an Israeli journalist friend of mine, wrote something after Shireen Abu Akleh was killed, where she breaks down the playbook that the Israeli military has for managing an awkward situation, which is basically lie. Like, start, lie, dissemble, muddy the waters, create doubt, etc. So, they've told you. They're lying to you because they're not sure what happened, what they might have done, what people are accountable for. And yet, there they are. Oh, the Israeli government tells us, and then when it's echoed by, I don't know, Canada and the US, well, then it must be true. So it's like, yes, I mean, there's no skepticism. So when I was at Time, for the last 6 months that I was there, I was banned from writing about Israel. Why? Because my boss, who knew that I knew more about the situation there than literally anybody in the organization, had been covering it for longer, when he was going on a visit to CP and interviewing me, come for a briefing, but suddenly, you can't write about Israel. Why? Because Ron Dermer, who was BB's political, whatever, chief of staff, had a direct line to his boss, and it was like, basically, you haven't done anything wrong, you haven't said anything that's not true, but you're not towing the line, essentially, and we expect you to toe the line. That's essentially, you are challenging the Israeli narrative by the way that you're analyzing these dynamics. So yes, I mean, mercifully, I managed to find a job at Jaskiran 6 months later. But what I wanted to say though quickly is, I saw plenty of cowardice at Time. I saw moral cowardice. I saw people who could not possibly believe what they were saying, but felt like a sense of connection, whatever. But I won't put this down to individuals. Although, don't lose heart. There is always space because of what Western media, because of the terms on which it operates. There's always space to actually open gaps. You saw after the Black Lives Matter rebellion here, the New York Times op-ed page suddenly more sensitive to people of color potentially expressing something. And so after the last Gaza, you saw, my friend and colleague Leila Al-Arian writing about her father's home in Gaza being destroyed on the op-ed page of the New York Times, where mostly it's whatever trash and vaudeville Tom Friedman and Brett Stevens, the Kardashians, they're famous for being famous and usually for being wrong. Okay, just a quick note. Essentially, it's worse than that. The problem is that US media is entirely embedded in the narratives of power, in its relationship with power. My colleagues, forget about Israel, they saw their role as stenographers. Their role was to explain to the readership, to the public, what the government was thinking. That's it, right? So unfortunately, you have a situation where you have a media culture where people identify entirely with power. They use the we all the time. You listen to CNN anchors. What are we going to do about Gaza? It's not even. They're not even hiding the fact that they're essentially they're satraps of the people in power. So that goes back to colonial era. I mean, AP, Reuters, those things were colonial information services, designed to tell you the price of commodities and other natives can live about, how to own the world. So, okay, I know time is short, but keep the pressure up because they do have to respond to what's happening on social media. They can't. There's an element in there. They do have to respond to the basic racism of which they're guilty. And you've seen changes in the New York Times. Of course, the battle's far from won, but you've seen things in the New York Times now and then, like the video forensics unit does, etc. And you're like, wow, in the New York Times, that's quite amazing. So yeah, keep fighting. That's all.
Okay, our next speaker is Andrew Ross. And let's see, he's a Liverpool fan. I'm an Arsenal fan. So we have certain tribal differences. But Andrew Ross is professor of social and cultural analysis at NYU. He's the author of many books, including Stone Men, the Palestinians Who Built Israel, and an organizer with several groups, including the AAUP and USA CDI, the American wing of the BDS movement. Welcome, Andrew.
Siddhartha. Hello, people. Marhaba. I'm coming from NYU, and last week we formed this new group, Faculty for Justice in Palestine. Some of my comrades are here this evening. 180 faculty signed our funding statement, and on Friday we had how do I advance this? Yes. I think this runs okay. All right. Friday we did our first joint solidarity action with student groups in both library. And so anyone here who wants to form a group of Faculty for Justice in Palestine, we're happy to talk to you afterwards. If your professors don't step up, then push them to do it. Students, okay? My comments this evening are going to be about dehydration. Because there are a lot of people in Gaza right now who are dying of thirst. They're about to die of thirst, as you probably know. And I just wanted to sum up for you in your mind's eye the symptoms of what happens when your body is deprived of access to water. You get dizzy, you have panic headaches, you have muscle cramps, then you have seizures, swelling of the brain, kidney failure, shock, coma, and then death. These are symptoms that are, I would say, they're symptoms of the latest in a long list of crimes against humanity that have been committed by the Israeli state. And the story in Gaza is a small part of a larger story, and I'm just going to make some comments about it this evening. I'm calling it colonization by dehydration. Not very elegant, but bear with me. Earlier this summer, I spent about a month in the West Bank, and I was visiting towns, villages, and cities, interviewing residents about the severe water shortage there. In a lot of the households, they hadn't seen water in 30 days. In Ramallah, many households are only getting 1 day of water a week. And there's no water shortage actually in Palestine. Ramallah, for example, has a much greater annual rainfall than London. And Ramallah, like other cities, towns in the West Bank, sits on top of a huge reservoir of groundwater, the Central Mountain aquifers. And the only problem is Palestinians are not allowed to dig. They're not allowed to dig wells. They can't access that water. Israel takes 80% of that aquifer, even though it's all in the West Bank. And the remaining 20%, they are in a position of controlling the water supply to Palestinians who sell the water to the West Bank. And so think of it this way: Israel is has a giant hand on a large faucet, and you can turn it on and off. And this summer, they turned a quarter of the way. The allocation to Bethlehem and Hebron was cut by 25%, just like that. You have to go outside of the towns and cities, however, into what's called Area C, which is 60% of the West Bank, controlled completely by Israeli military. And you will find the weaponization of water is resulting in the displacement of populations from those lands. These are all lands that are earmarked for Jewish settlement. Why? Because they're large areas of land and they don't have many Palestinians on them, so it's easy to push them off. They're also biblically significant lands. Zionists call these lands Judea and Samaria, the promised land. Gaza, by contrast, Gaza is actually not biblically significant at all. It's not a prized Zionist acquisition target. It's very commercially valuable real estate, coastal real estate, and God forbid you can imagine multi-million-dollar condos being sold there 10 years from now. But it's not biblically significant in the same way as the West Bank is. And what's happening in the West Bank in these lands is the settlers have been running rampage, and they've been weaponizing water in all sorts of ways to push populations off the land. They seized water springs. It's a picture of Israeli soldiers, actually. The soldiers are right behind the settlers, pouring cement into a water spring. They shoot out the water cisterns. And this is existential. You can stay on the land up to a point, but if you don't have access to water, you have to leave. And many of the communities that are being pushed off the land out there are Bedouin. Contrary to popular image, Bedouins are not particularly nomadic. Many of those communities have been settled in those locations for 30, 40, or 50 years. Their herds of livestock are absolutely critical to the urban food markets in the West Bank. So there's a lot happening when you push Bedouin off the land and take over. The settlers take over, and then what happens? Where do they get their water from? Jewish settlements in the West Bank have no problem finding water. They are allowed to dig. They use advanced technologies to pump water from the deep levels of the aquifer. And a lot of the settlements are also connected to the Israeli national water grid. And what that means is there's always enough water for swimming pools in the settlements and organic vineyards and the like. And down in the valleys, Palestinian communities are subsisting on very minimal consumption levels of water. Commentators have been calling it water apartheid for quite some time now. And it's obvious why that would possibly be a description. I think it's an inadequate description, however. It does not account for the proactive use of water deprivation to push people off the land. Other terms are needed for that. And until 2 weeks ago, a lot of commentators on Palestine had stopped, hesitated before using the term genocide. And in the last 2 weeks or so, I think the Israeli military state has crossed that line. People have begun to use that term. Why? Because there really is no other word in the vocabulary of international law and human rights. And so we have to use it. So a little history, because this is a teaching. Securing a water supply has always been central to the Zionist project. Absolutely central from the beginning. And a lot of the attention has been in the north, the Jordan River watershed, the Mount Hermon watershed, the Litani River watershed. The last two are in Lebanon, although Zionists tried to have the boundaries drawn so that they would be able to have those included in historical Palestine. That's where the water is, and the watersheds are not in the south. So during the mandate era of British rule from 1920 to 1948, hydrological surveys suggested that there wasn't enough water to support any more than 2 million people in historical Palestine. And so in 1937, the British authorities decided to restrict Jewish immigration. They said, there's not enough room for you here, we're not going to let you in. Zionist leadership lost their minds at this point after this white paper, as it was called, was published. And they did their own hydrological surveys and estimates, and they were mostly inflated, but they showed that there was much greater water supply available. And they could bring water from the north down to the south. And they persuaded the UN that this was possible, and this resulted in the UN partition plan of 1947, which allocated large amounts of what is now southern Israel to the Zionist settlers. And So after 1948, the Nakba, the new Israeli authorities stepped up their propaganda campaign of trying to persuade Jewish settlers to come to Israel. We're going to make the desert bloom. Remember that messaging, right? It's a little dodgy because calling it a desert is not exactly inviting for people to go there, right? But they had to call it a desert or a wilderness because to suggest that it was unpopulated or underpopulated. They prevailed by appealing to the technological superiority of the colonizing power, and what resulted was a vast amount of investment in these infrastructural projects that would divert water from the north to the south. A network of tunnels and canals and pipelines and reservoirs is called the National Water Carrier. It was completed in 1964. It was really important for the national unity of Israelis at the time. Here, the red part of this on this map shows you the main channels flowing from the north to the south. And then the tributaries from those reaching out towards the east. And what the map looks like more or less today, where all of these blue tributaries are part of the national water grid, reaching deep into the West Bank, which means that a lot of Israeli settlements, wherever they are connected to this water grid. Now, all of this infrastructure was built at the expense of the native population. No Palestinian really benefited in any way from the development of this infrastructure. And what this has meant is that Israel, certainly after 1967, after the occupation began and after the Oslo Accords, has virtually complete control over wherever water flows from the river to the sea. They also have control over electricity in the West Bank, and that's all important if you consider what's happening in Gaza right now. So let's talk about that. Even before the bombs started falling in peacetime, quote unquote, there's a terrible water shortage in Gaza. Gaza does sit on top of a coastal aquifer, but 97% of the water is undrinkable. And one of the reasons for that, highly contaminated, one of the reasons for that is that the Israeli army bombs the shit out of wastewater treatment plants every time they declare a campaign, a military campaign, and assault on Gaza. So in effect, they're poisoning the groundwater every time they do that. The other sources are a desalination plant, three desalination plants in Gaza. And there are also wells that are dug further from the scene. The water's not great, but they are dug. Now, I expect you know that at the same time that Israel cut off the water supply to Gaza, they also cut off the electricity. That means the desalination plants don't work. You can't pump water out of the wells because you need electricity. The only source of power that's left is solar power. Now, fortunately, about a fifth of Gazan households have access to some kind of solar power, and maybe one of the few silver linings you can see in the reconstruction of Gaza after all of this might be that solar power will be front and center of the reconstruction. Notwithstanding, however, that Israeli Palestinians have complete control over the import of solar panels, so that's a whole other problem. Let me skip forward because I don't have much time. I want to direct your attention to these maps because, I'm a writer, I love words, but sometimes images speak louder than words. And many of you have seen these maps, these images, some of you may not have done. They show, very clearly illustrate the progress of settler colonialism across these lands. Some maps lie, these ones do not. They speak the truth, I think. You really can't argue with them. You could draw similar maps of the progress of settler colonialism in this country and other settler colonial countries from history very easily. They would look much the same as this. The difference is that this has been happening in real time, in the full glare of cameras in an age of total information, and with tacit and full-throated approval of the major colonial powers, both current and former. And as regards American policy, let me plant one thought in your mind, an evil thought. You might lose some sleep over it, but I have no proof for this. But it would not surprise me in the least if Biden administration policy is being driven by the polling of a relatively small number of swing voters in swing states in the Midwest and in Florida with an eye in next year's election. That is an evil thought. But once again, if it's true, once again, the world is being held hostage to the fucked up logic of the American electoral system. My time is up. I just want to leave you with a few images. I am an atheist. I'm a materialist through and through, so sacred is not a term that comes easily from my lips. But if it were in my vocabulary, I would reserve it for the cause of water. And here I'm reminding you, water is life, which was the principal slogan around which the Standing Rock movement was formed. Professor Dhillon played a major role in this. Here's some other images which are relevant, I think, that speak louder than my words. And here's the introduction of Flint. You can add your own locations to that list, Kashmir and others. I'm sure you can add others. This is how those of us who work in environmental justice have to start thinking about how environmental warfare of the sort that I've been describing is perfectly illustrated in Palestine is going to play a much greater role in our thinking and in our social struggles going forward as climate change intensifies. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Our final speaker for today's event is Nadine Farhadi, is a Palestinian writer and researcher from Oman, currently a PhD student at New York University. She is a volunteer with the Palestinian Social Fund, a grassroots solidarity fund supporting agricultural cooperatives working towards food sovereignty and breaking economic dependence on the occupation in Palestine. A translation of Khadija Habashni's book, Nights of Cinema, The Story of the Palestine Film Unit, was published in May 23. Welcome.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for sticking around. مساء الخير. إذا في فلسطينية بالغرفة والله بستحي منكم بدكم تحضروني يعني رح أحكي بس بخجل وأحكي هيك مسبقا. So I thought I would give myself the task of offering a few humble remarks, not about Palestine, but about what we learn from Palestinians. And so I'll talk about two moments, one historic and the other contemporary, that have afforded me very deep lessons about the centrality of the land to our struggle. And so my intention is not to detract from the ghastly scene of genocide in Gaza, but rather to insist that this latest instance be viewed within a longer march towards the liberation of the land and its people. So I've heard many awesome teachings this week, and I've heard a lot of people start by saying something like, you know, the Nakba since 1948 means that this is or the context is 75 years of ongoing dispossession. And so 75 years since the Nakba is also 75 years of ongoing refusal. And so I insist that the long itineraries of loss and of dispossession have also bred richly textured lineages of revolt and historically dynamic traditions of anti-colonial resistance, which continue to reverberate. They acquire increasing relevance in moments like today, but they sort of proliferate, I think, for me, atmospherically somehow. So in the words of Lakota organizer and historian Nick Estes, I think it's important that we understand that our history is the future. And so I want to take you to the moment that for me is very exciting from a tradition of Palestinian poetry. So this is one of the first kind of coming together, politically committed poets that begins to coalesce around the moment of the 1970s. So this is a global moment of anti-colonial resistance and of armed struggle. But particularly the poetry begins to include people writing from exile with a sort of view of the horizon of the lost homeland. But it also includes poets writing under Israeli military rule from places like Nazareth or the Galilee, and others writing from the occupation prisons. And this moment is important because I think it begins to produce a sort of cacophony of voices. This unites Palestinians and refuses its singularity. You're hearing multiple different experiences that are all the result of loss and dispossession, but that are differently situated and had at that moment been considered separate. So there is a tendency to think that what happens in Gaza is separate from what happens in the West Bank, is separate from what happens to our Syrian brothers and sisters in the occupied Golan Heights, etc. But we return to this moment where the struggles are no longer siloed, where we can speak a collective voice and through collective tradition that unites Palestinians, not in sameness but in difference. And so what joins this tradition of Palestinian poets is land. They speak of their attachment to the land, which is an affirmation of their presence against persistent attempts by a secular state to rob them of their identity, to rob some who are refugees of the memory of that land, to rob others who remain resilient of their material existence with more and more theft. So I'm going to read to you an abridged version of the poem. It's called We Shall Remain. It's by the Palestinian poet Tawfiq Zayyad, who was a Palestinian communist, and in 1948 he remained in his hometown Nazareth and eventually became its mayor. This poem comes from an English translation that emerged in the United States in 1970, so this is super early for English translations. And the collection is called Enemy of the Sun. It is published by the Black Press Drum and Spear, based in Washington, D.C., and it's assembled specifically to introduce the Black radical poets to the tradition of the Palestinian Revolution. And this reference comes from a man called Greg Thomas, who's taught me a tremendous amount about the Panthers. So with that, we shall remain. Abridged. It is 1,000 times easier for you to pass an elephant through the needle's eye, to catch fried fish in the Milky Way, to plow the sea, to teach the alligator's speech. 1,000 times easier than smothering with your oppression the spark of an idea, or forcing us to deviate a single step from our chosen march. Like 20 impossibles, we shall remain in a lit, a ramle, a jalil. Here we shall remain, a wall on your chests. We starve, go naked, sing songs, and fill the streets with demonstrations and jails with pride. We breed rebellions, one after another, like 20 impossibles, we remain in a lit, a ramle, a jalil. Here we shall remain, we may drink the sea, we shall guard the shade of the olive tree and the fig tree, planting ideas, like the yeast in the dough, the coldness of ice is in our nerves, and the burning hell in our hearts. We squeeze the rock to quench our thirst, and if we starve, we eat the dirt and never depart or grudge our blood. Here we have a past, a present, and a future. Our roots are entrenched deep in the earth. Like 20 impossibles, we shall remain. Let the oppressor review his account before the turn of the wheel. For every action, there is a reaction. Read what is written in the book. Like 20 impossibles, we shall remain in a lid Ramla al-Jalil. And so I think Palestinians speaking out in the current moment against the genocide, the siege, and indiscriminate killing are students of some tradition and likely the one that is defining of the Palestinian experience. So while the urgency of the moment demands a certain economism or brevity in the way that we present facts or statistics, while the current moment applies upon us discursive conditions that are very much not of our choosing. I want you to be able to listen carefully and hear the reverberations of this tradition that might not be super audible, but that is cited and continues to be cited and remains super present. It's present. I think if you listen to someone like my friend and our comrade Muhammad al-Kurd, when he refuses to be interrogated by a news anchor, and in that I think it's incumbent upon us to hear a broader insistence that we shall remain, our coast shall remain on the land. So now, I think Andrew, thanks, you prefaced for me very nicely. But I'm going to shift registers to talk about a different politics of the land in the contemporary moment. And that's a bit about my work with the Palestinian Social Fund, which is a grassroots solidarity fund directly supporting agricultural cooperatives working towards food and land sovereignty and breaking economic dependence on the occupation in Palestine. In the fund, we are students of history. We recognize that our national movement was funded by those who reap wages in hard currency in the diaspora. And we think that the diaspora and our friends can continue to finance the project of liberation on the ground. So a bit about the cooperative movement that we provide unconditional support for. This has been growing in Palestine. Predominantly, we support people that occupy the West Bank. This is important. But there are about 30 co-ops right now, and it's growing. To give you a sense of how these co-ops work, one share, one vote, pooling labor and resources, etc. So, democratic, self-governed system of people deeply rooted in their communities. They cultivate subsistence crops that they and their communities eat, and they cultivate inherited land, but many of whom in areas that are predominantly Area C, which are slated for settler takeover. So many youths participating in the cooperative movement are first and foremost refusing the expropriation of their land, its resources, but they also refuse the more insidious, if less visible, modes of strangulation, which it's very difficult for you to conceptualize that it looks the same here as it does under occupation. But one of the dominant modes of strangling the occupied West Bank today is consumer debt and forcing people to work to pay off this debt. And so they refuse consumer debt and the structures of capitalism. They refuse to wait around for a Palestinian authority to give them dignified jobs. They refuse the terms of conditional donor aid, which repoliticizes their demands on Palestinian society. And so youth laboring in cooperatives today are also students of history. They learn particularly from their mothers and grandmothers. This is an episode that is perhaps less understood about the Palestinian intifadas, but it was really a moment that politicized the role of reproductive labor and put center stage like household management, consumer goods, etc. So they learned from that. So I wanted to talk about a particular cooperative that we fund. They are from the village of Safa, and their name is Land of Despair. So from them, I learned the enactment of what John Bircher, I think, rightly understood to be the defining Palestinian condition, which is that of undefeated despair. Adham Karaja, a member of the cooperative, says, quote, "In this world, it seems the more we know, the more despair we feel. But at the same time, we use this despair to fuel a productive path towards the future. Our aim is to develop the cooperative and to reach our social goals, to enshrine communal values and instill a reciprocal relationship with nature." And so while they do plant crops and use agroecological methods, it's also important to recognize, and echoes with the poem, that they also plant ideas and values, and this is perhaps even more important. And so in previous situations of this presentation, I usually end by saying, there can be no liberation if we don't have sovereignty over our daily bread. And then I do a call to action, which is www.palestiniansocialfund.com/fund, and ask you to contribute to supporting Popular Cradle for the native cooperative movement in Palestine. So do that with your money. But today I think I'll use my last words to dwell on something that feels more important, which is the insurgent embryonic qualities of despair. Many of us have worked tirelessly this past 2 weeks, writing statements, issuing calls for ceasefire, organizing direct actions, and putting together fundraisers. This is very important, and I don't discount the complexities of even putting together a room like this in an institution like this. Do not discount that. But I think we all feel despair when we are met with apathetic university administrators worrying about endowments, warmongering government officials refusing humanitarian aid, structures in place to silence any mention of Palestinians, let alone their liberation, and a broader sense that our knowledge, understanding, and even empathy falters at this moment, leaving us impotent in the face of unfolding catastrophe. So in the long run, I think we ought to learn from the land of despair and their autonomous, self-managed collective projects to build the institutions that will allow us to labor with unencumbered determination in service of a free Palestine.
We are almost out of time. Actually, we are beyond time, right? So we have time for a couple of questions. And I believe we are doing it in some incredible technological way. Okay, we're going to skip the technology because we're short of time. So what I'm going to do is I'll just carry the microphone and let's start from the back.
Hi everyone. First and foremost, I'd like to say thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us and giving us the opportunity to not only learn some new knowledge about what's currently going on in Palestine, but also to reinforce how we think about things and how we face the occupation. As we've heard from the past 2.5 hours, language does matter. And so my question is centered around the characterization of what's currently happening in Palestine as a genocide and an ethnic cleansing. So to people who are very reluctant to identify this as a genocide, what do you have to say to them? And how can you characterize what is currently happening? How can you justify characterizing the current situation in Palestine as a genocide? Because there are a lot of people who are in academic spaces who are given these platforms, but who choose to willingly mischaracterize and kind of talk down on the situation in Palestine to kind of appease others. And there are also students who support a lot of these organizations like Amnesty International, who have been reluctant to call this a genocide, given that this is the first time ever that we're experiencing this ethnic cleansing and genocide in real time with the use of technology, kind of dispatching information in real time, and yet people are still reluctant to characterize this as it is. So my question, after that digression, is what fulfills
your criteria for a genocide, and how does that apply to Palestine?
That's an excellent question. So there's a legal definition, but we're in an era right now where the law doesn't matter. So this is something that we have to keep in mind, is very intentional when those with power decide, now the law matters, and then now the law doesn't matter. The law matters to these people, but it doesn't, or it applies to these people, but it doesn't apply to these people. In this case, it's international law. So we just need to recognize the hypocrisy and the double standards. If international law suddenly, well, what's the definition of genocide under international law? It is the intent to destroy a nation or a group of people. And ethnic cleansing is the intent to physically cleanse or remove the people from a particular land, which could include killing them or forcibly displacing them violently. So the question, if you want to get into a legal dispute or a legal debate, is really about what are the motivations of Israel. I stated this about 10 days ago on Twitter, and everyone thought that I was unreasonable, is a nice way to put it. But my statement is the end game of Israel is to push Gazans into Sinai. That is the end game. Is to create, so essentially to move the Gazans to a border that they, either the Egyptians capitulate and say, we'll let them in exchange for all sorts of money that will go into the Egyptian regime's pocket. And, or that there will be so many people so desperate because they have no water, no food, no electricity, that they will just physically all figure out a way to cross the border, right? So I think the ethnic cleansing is very, I see the facts as very clear. Right? And in fact, Israel has said, Egypt, take them. We want Egypt to take them. And the whole talk about being temporary is completely bad faith. And in fact, Sisi's response was, well, if you are trying to evacuate Gaza temporarily to go after Hamas, this is an official claim, well then evacuate them westward, right? In the Negev, which is still within Israeli state borders. Why do you need to go south? And that was radio silence. Because they want to ethnically cleanse them outside. So then the question becomes, okay, why are you denying them water? Why are you denying them food? Why are you denying them fuel that, as we talked about today, is necessary for water and food, or at least water? And if you don't have water, you die a very painful way. And we are now in day 14. The humanitarian aid that's being sent is a cover. It's less than 1% of what the needs are in a day for 2.3 million. Let me just pick your American city that is 2.3 million people. And imagine that entire city, everybody in that city is getting bombed, has no fuel, no electricity, no water, running out of food. And imagine you're in that city. Humanize it. Pretend it's you. So I think that's the genocide. So it's genocidal policies that are on the way to genocide in terms of trying to eliminate Palestinians from Gaza. And so it's a legal technicality, whether it's ethnic cleansing or genocide, depending on what the motivation is. But the ethnic cleansing is clear, because they've stated, we want them out. We're trying to get them out of Israel. They've stated it multiple times. And also the statements that they're human animals. They want to destroy the human animals, they want to kill the human animals. So there's plenty of statements by the government, various government officials, and then if you match that with the practices and the policies, right? And then the other question is, and this is how you know racism is alive and well, switch the actors. Switch the actors and put the actors that are being targeted, that as members of political powerful groups, or members that your society demonizes, right? The closer they are to whiteness and the closer they are to Judeo-Christian identity, the more, and then pretend that the perpetrators are brown or black, or Arab or Muslim. Same facts. What would be your response? What would be society's response, the US government's response, the media's response? And that answer is a law. That's the whole selective enforcement of law, which causes the international law to be illegitimate, which is what helps dictators rebuke any attempts by our country to enforce international law. And I'm going to put a little pitch in for my book, which was written, published before the siege and this ethnic cleansing and these genocidal policies that effectively will culminate in genocide, which essentially explains why there is no empathy for Palestinians. There is no empathy for Muslims. There's no empathy for Arabs. In the last 22 years, all of us have been primed through education, media, public rhetoric, laws, the war on terror, to presume that Muslims are inferior, right? That Arabs, Muslims, Palestinians, it's all wrapped up into one, and I have a chapter about the Palestinian terrorist stroke. It's a pre-9/11 precursor to the post-9/11 Muslim terrorist stroke. But all of us have been primed to see people within that homogenized group as dangerous, as anti-liberal, anti-American, anti-democratic, and anti-Semitic. So the ground has been already planted. It doesn't take much to convince people that these Palestinians deserve it. And whatever the Israelis are doing, and do not underestimate the intentional correlation or connection that's been going on for decades between Israeli identity and Israeli government and Europeanness and whiteness, right? It doesn't mean anti-Semitism isn't real in America, but the way that Israel has been able to get the American government, American people to side with it, has been to portray itself as the only democracy in the Middle East, to portray itself as a European white outpost amid savage, barbaric Arabs and Muslims who want to kill them and kill Arabs. And they intentionally invoke the clash of civilizations, which actually originated in Europe and part of Orientalism, right? And I talk about in the book how that's been transferred. So it's a little bit long-winded, but.
Thank you, Tom. That was very useful. I just want to add one or 2 points. You don't have to use the term genocide to have a very powerful critique of what's going on. It's actually not that necessary. But if you do, it triggers a hornet's nest for reasons I think should be obvious to everyone, given how effectively the Israeli state and the Zionist project has weaponized the memory of the Holocaust and has been very effective at transmuting grief over lost Jewish lives into violence and power of a very powerful military state. So just 2 points then. One is that when you're talking about genocide, people have this idea that it has to be in some massive scale. Millions of people have to die. That actually, according to international legal definitions, is not sufficient. You can have a small number of people who are wiped out, and that constitutes a genocide. But the second point I would make, and it relates to the first comments I made, I think the most effective voices right now for talking about genocide are Jewish voices for peace. And they have begun to do so. And they've taken up the slogan, never again means never again for anyone. And it's very effective, and it totally dismantles this sense of unity in the Jewish community. And people who purport to speak for the Jewish community and so on and so forth. And I feel that they are the voices that should be foregrounded when the charge of genocide is made, and they are stepping up to do so, and we should encourage them to do.
We're running out of time, so we take 2 questions at the same time, and then we'll close it out. I hope we can continue the discussion. It's outside of the space, and we can turn it over. So I'm just going to, okay, yeah, so I'll just take 2 questions.
Thank you. I'll try and keep this brief. The presentations today were extremely informational, and I just want to thank all the presenters for making this so comprehensive. One topic that I thought kind of hadn't really been addressed, however, was the transition from the Palestinian and the Israeli left in the past from topics of internationalism to the modern line of national liberation, for instance. I'm reminded of an article by Mats penned in 1974 after the PFLP attack on Aviv in one of the kibbutzes in Israel. Mats writing, quote, "That is why your operation aroused such lively reactions in Israel, both among the various strands of the Zionist camp and among the revolutionary organizations in the left-wing public. It is no coincidence that Golda Meir, head of the very government that had for years been expropriating, oppressing, and massacring Palestinians, reacted beyond her habitual way and was not satisfied with her usual epithets, murderers, etc., but added, 'This is the same Hawatmeh who tries to lure us to a living together of Jews and Arabs.' She did so, in our view, out of fear, albeit hidden. The Palestinian revolutionary forces possess a weapon that is very dangerous for Zionism, the internationalist alternative that the Palestinian revolutionaries may present to the masses of Israeli Jews. This is the revolutionary socialist program that may rally masses of both peoples, Palestinian Arab and Israeli Jewish." And just reading down a bit, it includes the indictment, "We must be frank. Your operation in Malat has intensified and deepened the enmity between the masses of the two people, and, as we well know from our daily experience, has served Zionism." So maybe this is a bit of a provocation, but I do want to hear the panelists' thoughts on this matter, namely, what has kind of caused the transition from a perspective and critique internally of international politics to one of national liberation, and what are their ends?
Just take one more question and
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah, so, I'm gonna keep this brief, I promise. One, I'd just say, and this is in no way meant to be like, I disagree with the panelists or anything, but with the call for ceasefire, I also really encourage then a follow-up of reversing the siege, and ending the siege, because unfortunately I see a lot where there is a certain point where liberals are like, okay, this is what we can achieve, but then there's not acknowledgement of what happens after that. So my question is, I know it was mentioned earlier on in the panel, I can't remember who, but it was about how Americans are also, us being part of the imperial core means that we are not responsible for what the US does in contributing to Israel's attack on Palestine. And when we saw all of those statements coming out after October 7th, where many people with big platforms were all like, I cry for the innocent victims of Israel, and then now we're seeing sort of this both sidesism where, oh my gosh, innocent people, period. I would love to hear some thoughts or reflections on this sense of innocence, and how I personally think that there is often a lack of sort of that we can acknowledge here in America that like we are not innocent in this participation, and I'm not saying anyone here is agreeing with this, but like I don't think enough people are commenting on like people in Israel are also not innocent by like being there, and like civilians, while I'm not encouraging an attack on civilian life, I wish there was more of a commentary or just some thoughts on like this notion of innocence when you are a settler in a place that's not yours. Thank you.
Who's responding to international?
I'm happy to respond to the first one. So internationalism is dead. And that was the transnational kind of post-colonial movement in the region. And he died in 79 when Sadat, Egypt's president, signed a peace treaty. Because once they neutralized Egypt, it was a brilliant move by the Israelis, and that's why they really knew about the sign. It was a big exchange for them. But they knew that if they neutralized the biggest army, that was their neighboring country, then the Palestinian desire or movement for liberation was dead. It was over. And that's also why we wanted to attack. There were many reasons why the US occupied and attacked Iraq, but one was that Saddam was in transition and was continuing at least its support. He was trying to be the next Arab nationalist, unsuccessful. That's the first reason. And in fact, the transnational movement in the region is pan-Islamism. It's political Islam that replaced Arab nationalism as the transnational ideological movement in the region. And this country has educated you, indoctrinated you, taught you to believe that pan-Islamism is terrorism. That pan-Islamism is Al-Qaeda, it's ISIS. Right? But it is, if successful, it is a true threat to Western hegemony in the region. Because it's effectively the modern iteration of the Ottoman Empire, which was, in fact, a real political competition and was the barrier, or once the Ottomans fell, it's been called the Western colonialist countries and colonized. The Middle East, which is different than say South Asia, which is much longer. So that's kind of in a nutshell. The other is neoliberal capitalism. No, it goes back to that. That has it's been exported successfully to the region, all over the world. And you all are its first targets, and you're subject to that, which is focused on materialism, hedonism, consumerism, individualism. So do not be collectivist, do not be communitarian, do not be political, beyond a very superficial, no, for a party that doesn't care about you anyway, because the only thing that care is the longest. You want to know why your politicians vote a certain way? Just find out what the special interest lobbies, whatever they are giving them. And Citizens United, which is a Supreme Court decision, plus that said, yes, we give the legal legitimacy, the constitutional legitimacy to allow special interest groups, political action committees, to effectively give as much as they want, corporations or people. That's what's on here. You want to know why your university presidents are not making principled decisions? Because they are corporate executives that serve shareholders, and the shareholders are the donors. They are not there to educate you. That's not their role. Their role is to make 500,000 plus a year with full benefits and move up the ladder with the corporate commercialized university, complex and to satisfy their shareholders. And so effectively it's happening with certain alumni. In this case, they are alumni who are self-described Zionists. And they are engaging in the same political activity that they do with congressional leaders. Letters, donations, threatening to keep donations. And so your presidents don't work for you, they don't serve you, you are not their client. They don't care about you, other than making sure that you get the financial aid that essentially takes money from the federal government and into the university and then alumni. So the only people who really care about you are tenured faculty. I should say no one care, that's not part-time faculty. Sorry, that's not what I know. That's not fair. The only people who have, let me restate that. So, strike the record. All of your teachers and professors care. But the only professors who can act on it independently are tenured professors. And that's why it is not a coincidence that every single university is adjunctifying. They want all your professors to have no tenure, including the liberal universities in the East Coast. So if you just go look at the data, how many of your professors in your department, how many were there were tenured lines, and how many of them were adjuncts, and I can guarantee you it's significantly less in 2023 than it was in 2013, 2003, 1990. You just keep going backwards, right? Because the university is a commercial entity that is trying to make as much profit while the state, and public institutions in particular, are defunded. So the percentage of the revenue of public universities on average is between 20 to 30% right now from the state. So in the 1970s, it was 70% was coming from the state. So this is all part of a complex system.
I can try to talk about indices, yeah. Test out my skills at being concise. I'm happy to point you to some resources on this. I think Maya Dashi wrote about this in the context of the 2014 invasion. There's a bit by Murad also generating about this now. I think the tweet that I've seen going around is we mourn our men, we care about them too. It's not just women and children. But that's just to say that to point out a kind of logic of who counts as a civilian. Most things that we're talking about that fall under international law, this is a normative colonial world order. Okay? These are all institutions that uphold colonial worldview. And so part of who counts as civilian is also entangled in all of these ways that fix sort of settler colony. And so you see that the hysteria around they walked right into our homes because we think that private property, security, the retrenchment of borders around the settlements that were invaded. Israelis can claim to be private citizens, whereas in Gaza they break down the borders between things, but veritably there is nowhere to hide, and part of that reflects on who counts. Within a kind of liberal calculus of civilian blah blah. And so I sort of would prefer the commentarians to not venture into the structure. I think there's already a lot that has been said. And by Palestinian women,
Speak to your first question about expanding from ceasefire to breaking the siege. It's just unfortunate about, again, American attention spans, what makes the news and what doesn't. It's unfortunate that it takes so much bloodletting for Gaza to be in the news. There have actually been many attempts to break the siege on Gaza. There was the flotillas that tried to break the siege by sea that came from Turkey and were attacked viciously by the Israeli military. There are Egyptians who amassed at the border in Rafah. There have been many attempts to break the siege. And of course, there's many scholars who have written about this. It's just unfortunate that these are the moments that we remember because, it's the very fact that a place called like the Gaza Strip exists is a criminal act. And it should not be normalized. There's a long history of attempts to break that since the creation of it, but unfortunately, these are the times that most people pay attention.
All right, I think that about brings us to the end for tonight. Before you leave, I just want to again call attention to the what you can do slide. Email or call elected officials. There's a website there. It's been mentioned multiple times. Sahara Aziz has her amazing book here. If you want to pick up a copy of that, there are upcoming demonstrations everywhere across the world, including here in the United States. And a big one on November 4th in Washington, D.C., a national march on Washington to free Palestine. You can write articles, get in touch with us, the faculty that are here from the new school to learn about what else we're going to be doing, share resources, engage in study, protect and support one another. And thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you to our amazing and incredible panel of speakers. Tonight and for sharing all of your wisdom and knowledge and
work with such grace and so much heart. So thank you for all joining us. And thank you all for being here and to Common Oceans Press for doing the live stream. Anything else you want to say before we close out?
Well, thank you to our individual colleagues who helped us when the departments did not, and the administration was reluctant, certainly in my divisions. So we'd like to, Jaskiran and I are really thankful to individual faculty members who went out of their way, and of course to the students of justice for Palestine. Thank you.
So the Center for Security, Race and Rights is doing teach-ins across the country, online or in person. So if you want to do a teach-in in your respective location, csrr@law.rutgers.edu, or just go to our website and there's a contact us. But right now, we want to do as many of these teach-ins as possible. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.